Welcome to Cooper and Cary Have Words. My name is James Cary and I'm a comedy writer for the BBC, living in the south of England, and every fortnight I have words with my fellow Reformed Christian friend, Barry Cooper, writer, podcast producer, and I'm going to say former comedian, but I'm already worried, Barry, that we're writing comedy checks that our podcast isn't going to cash. Is that fair?
I don't know about writing comedy checks. I think we've already amassed a gross national debt, more of, several trillion, if we're using that analogy.
Yeah, that may well be true. How are you, Barry?
I'm doing all right. It's been a crazy week, fairly chaotic for all sorts of reasons, but it's always good to get here. And one of the things that's become a hallmark is we don't like to waggle on the T, so we want to get straight in.
We are going to get straight in.
Introduce a wonderful and hopefully familiar to some of you voice, a third voice. Who is it, James?
Well, it's a welcome return for our friend who we spoke to all the way back in episode 63. Do you remember episode 63?
Good times, yeah.
Evangelist and author Randy Newman. Hello to you, Randy.
It's great to be with you guys. Thanks so much.
We are thrilled that you're able to be with us. Your previous book and that episode title was Unlikely Converts. And your latest book is called Mere Evangelism. In fact, Barry and I can wave our copies now.
There we are, 4,000 miles apart, these copies currently.
And
amazing.
As the title suggests, of your previous book, An Unlikely Convert was C.S. Lewis, who wrote Mere Christianity, on which your book is kind of based. So I just thought we'd start out with the full quote about the most reluctant convert in England. As C.S. Lewis says, "You must picture me alone in that room in Magdalen, night after night, feeling whenever my mind lifted, even for a second from my work, the steady and unrelenting approach of him whom I so earnestly desired not to meet. That which I greatly feared had at last come upon me. In the Trinity term of 1929, I gave in and admitted that God was God, and knelt and prayed. Perhaps that night the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England." It's inspiring stuff, isn't it? "I did not then see what is now the most shining and obvious thing, the divine humility, which will accept a convert even on such terms. The prodigal son at least walked home on his own feet. But who can duly adore that love which will open the high gates to a prodigal who is brought kicking, struggling, resentful, and darting his eyes in every direction for a chance of escape?" Is that reluctant conversion more common than we might expect?
No, I don't think Lewis's experience is all that typical. And in fact, that experience that you just read about was the first of his two-stage conversion. He first got converted from atheism to theism. And then it was sometime after that he actually became a Christian. So the reluctance was this, oh no, God really does exist. But it was without any of the grace and the wonder of the cross, at least not yet. So it was a two-stage thing. I do think a lot of people do feel that sense of, oh, I've been wrong for so long, and giving up that can feel pretty painful for a lot of people.
And I guess there's that sense of dread about what the future might hold, bearing in mind the Christians that they know and how their life looks, and maybe the things they have to let go of.
Sure. Yeah. And I think that that's getting more weighty as time goes on, as people think, oh no, I've got to become. And then they probably have a whole list of things, So I don't know which of, different lists or whatever. I think if I were becoming a Christian right now, one of my thoughts might be is, oh no, I probably have to stop cracking jokes. Christians are so serious, and not only are they serious, but they're humor impaired. They don't get jokes, and so you crack a joke and they go, oh no, that's really quite serious. You really shouldn't joke about that because so that would probably be one of my horrible fears if that was the point that I was at now today.
I was doing a lot of comedy when I got converted in 1992. And I have this distinct memory of saying to a Christian friend of mine as I walked across the road towards King's College in Oxford, I said to her, I just don't think as a Christian I can justify trying to be funny anymore. And she turned to me and just said, "Oh, don't be such an idiot, Cooper." So that was quite good. That was quite a good bit of reasoning there, which stood me in good stead. So yeah.
And that was a funny way for her to put it too.
And if only a professional comedy writer and Reformed Christian could write some books on that subject, then I don't know.
Look at that.
Maybe. Anyway,
those of you who are listening on audio, by the way, there's just been a seamless plug for two of James's books there.
The Sacred Art of Joking and The Gospel According to a Sitcom Writer. But we're not here to talk about my books, at least not exclusively here.
No.
Okay, but I do want to say something though, because I think for someone who does a lot of comedy, writing or stand-up comedy, whatever, there is a sense where, okay, nothing is sacred. Everything is okay to make fun of. Everything is fodder to belittle and mock. And when you become a Christian, it's, well, no, wait a minute. There are some things that I probably shouldn't joke about. So that's why there is some basis, I think, for that idea of, I have to no longer be funny. No, but it is going to be different than the irreverent, everything is to be mocked kind of comedy.
And it's kind of a way of looking at the world, isn't it, as well? I always felt that to do my best work as a comedian, I had to have my comedy specs on the whole time. So all of life was kind of grist to the mill of comedy, which meant that I suddenly found myself in that rather uncomfortable feeling of, being in situations where I felt like I ought to not have those comedy specs on. And just finding that really uncomfortable to remove. So I think that there is something to be said there.
Talking of sense of humour failures, I'd like to at this moment mention Eustace Scrubb. Eustace Scrubb is potentially the hero of The Voyage of the Dawn Treader by C.S. Lewis. And I heard recently that someone says, well, of course, Eustace Scrubb, who had a sense of humour failure about being in Narnia and kept demanding to be taken to the British consulate and all that kind of stuff from a very serious family, very secular family. Some say that was Lewis writing about himself. Is there anything in that, do you think?
Yeah, I think there is. And I'm trying to remember if, he ever admitted that in print outside. There is something about the fact that the first line of that book is something close to, there once was a boy named Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and he almost deserved it. That was the first line. And so Eustace Clarence Scrubb and C.S. Lewis, Clive Staples Lewis. Lewis disliked his name from very early on. As a young child, said, "I want
good. Finally, we've got something in common." Sorry.
That's why he always insisted on being called Jack. So I think there is something to that, and Eustace is such an important picture. I talk about him a bunch in the book because there's that point where he turns into a dragon. And then he tries to scrape off the shell of the dragon himself, and he just can't. And he has to allow Aslan, the lion, the Christ figure, to scrape it off. And it's painful, but it's liberating eventually. And he can't do it himself. And I think Lewis knew that about the sanctifying process, that it is painful and you can't do it yourself. He always, I think we get glimpses or glimmers of that process in Lewis's life when he tells it third hand about someone else. So in this case, it's Eustace, are also in the Screw Tape letters. I think there's a lot of autobiography of the Screw Tape letters that Lewis may have been laughing at himself a little bit about that.
I was interested you picked up on that analogy, well, the part of the story where Eustace, who has become a dragon, is then restored painfully by a lion. And it's so vivid, isn't it, in the story? And I just wonder if we could talk a bit about the imagination in the world of evangelism. And there's a specific chapter on that, chapter 6 in your book, The Value of Imagery. And I just wonder if, and I think you've probably put your finger on it, that as Christians, we're maybe too hung up on proving Christianity is true rather than helping people wish it was true. Because earlier we just talked about that dread of, oh my goodness, it's true. Rather than creating a world in which people are delighted and thankful that it's true.
Mm-hmm.
And the arts really help us do that, don't they? And yet we don't, Christians don't really want to go down that road very often.
It seems to me the two biggest lessons that we must learn from C.S. Lewis in evangelism is the importance of pre-evangelism, building a gradual case for it, and then engaging the imagination. And Lewis couldn't help himself talking in imaginative terms because he just was that way from a very young child. And that's what he had developed so much before becoming a Christian. So he couldn't turn it off. In the same way that you might say that you guys can't totally turn off the comedy. So he always was, he just talked in images, and he would talk about, becoming a Christian is like turning full speed astern. It's like laying down your arms. It's like a statue becoming alive. It's like someone waking up after a long sleep and gradually realizing that they're awake. And he would paint the pictures first and then do the explaining. So we need to do both. We do need to make arguments, and Lewis was brilliant at it, but he wove the two together in a way that very few of us do now. And it's always been a tremendous need, and we've got to do more of it, I think, now more than ever, because we're in a very, people see lots of visual images, and we like stories and fantasy. So those are the two biggest lessons that I hope people get from what I was ranting and raving about in the book.
Just words, but good words. That's where ideas begin. Maybe you should listen to them.
So what do you say to those folks? And perhaps it's the particular preserve of, conservative evangelicals. And I'm sure you've heard it. You allude to it in the book a little bit, where people say, look, there's no point in offering all these arguments, using all this imagination, even if I had it, which I don't, I can't be doing all that. Just preach the gospel. That's God's power for the salvation of those who believe. You can't persuade people into the kingdom. We've heard all that lots of times. So what is your response to that kind of line of thought?
I'm tempted to say, well, I think maybe making faces, making fun of the people, start crying, but no, I'm sorry, probably none of that. No, I think the best and strongest argument against that is look at the Bible. It's filled with imagery and it's filled with logical arguments, both. And it does appeal to logic and intellect and reason. And it does appeal to imagination and story and fantastic images.
I mean, the gospel itself is a story, right? In that it's a historical narrative. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. The fact that the gospels are told to us as narrative and story, and we're given details just to help us kind of be there and get our imaginations involved. And then, look at, the classic illustrations, not examples. When Jesus met with Nicodemus in John chapter 3, it's a theological argument. He's trying to engage this very intelligent, learned, religious Jewish man. And yet he begins with born again, an image that Nicodemus doesn't get, because he's being very literal. How can a man enter a mother's womb? He's like, no, you're missing the imagery. And then Jesus comes back at it from another angle. It's like the wind, and you hear it and you don't really know where it's coming from or where it's going from. I mean, that's a beautiful image. But then the very next chapter, then Jesus is talking to a woman at the well who's not a religious practitioner, and she's not a moral, upright person. She's actually quite immoral. And Jesus starts by talking about water. Wouldn't it be great if you could drink water that when you drank it, you'd never be thirsty again? I mean, feel the imagery and the emotional appeal there. So what I want to say to people is, we have so much example of Jesus and Paul and the prophets using logic and argument and reason, and also imagery and poetry and images, that's what we should do too. I think the argument, we should just preach a logical presentation, is the one that needs to try to find support for that in Scripture. And now I do know there are places about, the simplicity of the gospel, sure, but there's too much other stuff all in the Scriptures themselves to encourage us to engage those things.
I think what's really interesting about those examples in John, and John is a bit of an obsession of mine at the moment, is how, one is how religious leaders particularly just keep taking Jesus literally at the wrong time and figuratively at the wrong time, and they just keep kind of toggling between the two, and they're always wrong.
Eat your flesh and drink your blood. How do we do? What's that? Yeah,
is Jesus saying he's going to kill himself? What does that mean? It's like, and it's kind of funny. But it's amazing how Nicodemus is kind of baffled and like, what do you mean be born again? How could I do that? And you could imagine him, and we don't, as often in John, we don't get an end of the scene. You just the camera kind of pans away onto Jesus, and we just assume that Nicodemus is wandering away, scratching his head, bumping his way through the dark on the way home, going, wow, I really didn't expect that. And the woman at the well is just like, this water sounds great. How can I get some? Yes, please. She completely leans in, and then she, runs back to her village saying, Jesus did everything. Jesus told me everything I ever did, and he knows me. And yet, but what's interesting is it sounds like, yeah, Nicodemus, what a clown. She gets it right, but actually Nicodemus is there at the end.
Oh yes,
It's stunning how you see the intermediate Nicodemus in the middle of John going, this isn't quite playing out how I expected, and there he is at the end wrapping up Jesus's body. And I think in a way we don't want to puzzle people, and yet sometimes you puzzle them and walk away, and they start to unwrap it in their heads, and we kind of don't want to do that, it seems, and that's where the arts really comes in, doesn't it?
Oh my, yes. By the way, I love the character of Nicodemus. He shows up in John 3, then he's there again in, I think it's chapter 7. And he says something positive in chapter 7, but you kind of wonder, like, what's going on there? What is he? We don't know. And then he shows up again in 19, and it sure seems like he's become a believer. But isn't Nicodemus the perfect outworking of that analogy that being born again is like the wind? There's a mysterious nature about it, and you can't quite totally figure it out. And yet there's no denying it. When you feel a breeze, there's no question about it. And so I think Nicodemus is the perfect illustration that John wove into his gospel account, so that again, artistically, dramatically, narratively, people would not just understand the intellectual concept of being born again is like the wind. It's like, oh, it's like what Nicodemus experienced. You talk about the arts. Well, here, let me just kind of push back. I'm all in favor of us using the arts, and I argue for it in the book. But I understand why people are nervous about it. I mean, and there are dangers. Historically, the arts have gotten people very, very far away from God and godliness and morality. And so the arts have been used for indulging lust and sensual pleasure and all sorts of problems. So it is dangerous. I had a conversation with Brett McCracken, who's with the Gospel Coalition, and he's a film critic, and he talked about art. And, the nature of art, a large part of it is being creative, coming up with new things that haven't been done before. You look at a certain item and, well, let's do it differently. Let's not just push the boundaries, let's obliterate the boundaries. Okay. That's kind of the nature of art: creativity, spontaneity, new horizons. The nature of theology is you get it right. It's here's truth, and truth is good, error is bad. Here are the lines. So theology by its essence is stay inside the lines or you'll get into a lot of trouble. Art is break outside the lines so that you can really explore the beauty. Now, I don't think that their enemies are antithetical, but we should at least recognize, well, here there's good reason why people are a little nervous when we talk about art and drama and all those things.
Hello. I am your Cooper Cary virtual assistant. I am predestined to assist you.
I think, as you were saying that, though, there are two kinds of theology, and there's the Calvin Institute systematic theology kind of stuff, which has its place. But then there's this other kind that I think people are rediscovering, and kind of goes back to your first book, Questioning Evangelism, which I still say is in my top 3 best Christian books I have ever read. And I'm going to say it again, go and buy Questioning Evangelism.
Wow.
Yeah. It's up there with Don Carson's, whatever it's called now, Call to Spiritual Reformation and Orthodoxy by G.K. Chesterton. Those are my top 3. So wow. Not kidding, not blowing smoke. But in that book, you're arguing about the rabbinic, the Jewish way of engaging in conversation and engaging with theology and asking questions of questions. And I've been listening to quite a lot of podcasts really that have really gone back to a Jewish way of thinking when it comes to, so Abraham is called to sacrifice his own son. What? Let's talk about that. And, and it's talking about it theologically, rather than just saying, okay, so let us discuss the sovereignty of God, or let us discuss and actually there's just another way of doing it. And it reminds me of that moment in your book where you say that C.S. Lewis didn't answer questions, he discusses them, which I think is a really interesting kind of artsy way of doing theology, maybe.
Sure.
Is there anything in that?
There's something about a dialogue or a question answering, back and forth kind of questioning, a gradual telling of a story that moves people along from unbelief to belief or from resistance to acceptance. And we can tend to think, well, it's just a matter of conveying information. You don't know these 4 things. Let me tell you these 4 things. There. Now you know those 4 things. Are you ready to become a Christian? And again, I don't want to pit things against reason and argument, because there's so much of that in the scriptures and in Jesus's arguments. I think we need to be very much aware of you can come up with wrong answers. I mean, Jesus was constantly telling the Pharisees they got it wrong. They didn't understand God. So there are wrong answers, but just delivering the answer is not always the way to go. It's gradually moving people from no, I think this is ridiculous, to wait a minute, man, I really haven't thought about this very much, to there might actually be something there, to oh, if this is true, then man, have I been stupid. And if this is true, I'm going to have to change a whole lot. But you know what? If this is true, could it really be? This sounds really good to my Lord and my God. And even that was a condensing of the process. So for a lot of us, it's not just learning facts. It's being transformed from sinful, rebellious, I don't want any part of this, to, I want to be adopted by a loving, gracious God. And for a lot of people, there's a lot of intermediate steps.
Yeah, because conversion itself it's not as if at the moment of conversion, I had a pretty dramatic one in the space of a week or so. It wasn't that I suddenly learned a bunch of new information. It was that there was a change of orientation of the heart, so that I suddenly wanted these things to be true. And that is not something, it seems to me, that comes about through just, okay, here's some more information. It's a reorientation of the affections. And that's where I think imagery, metaphor, art is uniquely placed to sort of coax new affections out of a person. And it's interesting, you pick up on Lewis, the way that he heads off the criticism of, well, that sounds like you might be being a bit manipulative. And he says that brilliant thing about, well, remember what fairy stories are for. It's not just about enchanting people, it's also about breaking spells.
Yes.
It's also about recognizing that people are actually living in a delusion, a spell which needs to be dispelled. And I love that. I think that's exactly right. That wasn't a question, that was a statement.
Yeah, that was toward the end of his sermon, The Weight of Glory. And he raised this question. He said, do you think I'm trying to cast a spell on you? And what you expect him is, well, no, I would never do that. I would never be so manipulative. And he says, well, spells are for breaking enchantments that aren't good. And we, as a culture, he said, we've all been under the spell of materialism and naturalism for so long that we need something dramatic to break out of that. I love that whole thing of, oh, maybe I've been deluded. And in fact, then we start reading the scriptures and yes, we were deluded. Well, it was worse. We were dead in our transgressions and sins, but we were deceived by the prince of the power of the air. So we need something dramatic to break out of that. For me, I think the process had to be a whole series of terrible disappointments. And for me, it was going to all of these classical music concerts and hoping that I was going to finally hear the piece of music that was going to be my piece of music, the one that was, the one that captured, all right, basically, I was looking for salvation in a musical experience, and it never happened because music can't do that. Music is a pointer; it's a secondary thing, and so it was this whole series of no, that didn't do it. Oh, that was okay. Well, I thought that one was going to do it. I mean, I still vividly remember the first time I heard Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake. It was like, oh, this is it. This is the piece I've been looking for. And then before it was over, it changed. And I remember thinking, why did he do that? Why did Tchaikovsky do it? He had it. He had the perfect moment. And then he switched. It was almost like from minor to major. It's like, what do? And then by the end of the piece, I was like, oh, please shut up. And and so it was this whole sequence of disappointments. And then when I read that in Mere Christianity, where Lewis says there are all these disappointments, and either we keep chasing after another, and I thought another symphony, or we become a cynic, which is also where I landed a whole lot, and then he throws out that absolutely brilliant line of, if I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was meant for another world. And by the way, I think, really? Is that really the most probable explanation? Well, when he says it, it's like, oh, I hadn't thought of that. But that is so liberating of, oh, that's why there are disappointments. And so now I can listen to Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake and I love it. I just absolutely love it. And when I get disappointed at the end, it goes, yeah, it's not supposed to satisfy. It's supposed to be a pointer.
It's very good. And to what extent does that have a lesson then for our evangelism? Because we sort of want our evangelism always to satisfy in our heads. We want to go through all of the 6 boxes of 2 ways to live or whatever it is. You talk a lot about this in the book, but you say prepare yourself for a long hike rather than a short walk. Is it okay for there to be disappointment in our presentation when we're trying to talk to our non-Christian friends about the gospel? Should we deliberately build in cliffhangers and sort of untied ends and things like that?
I think so, yes. Now, so the challenge is we have to be very sensitive to what the Holy Spirit is doing in a person's life and in what he is showing us and giving us insight about, because we could be coming in at the tail end of a very long process and the person's ready. They're ready to pray a prayer and sing hallelujah. Okay, great. But so we need to be prepared for that aspect of the task, that part of the process. But what we haven't prepared ourselves for is all of those other evangelistic moments where, you know what, maybe at the end of this conversation, I need to allow the person to feel uncomfortable, and for me to be uncomfortable, because what I'd really like, I'd really like to end every conversation with them and me singing hallelujah. That'd be fun, but there are, and again, for me, it's remembering those disappointments where I need to say to someone, there's so many things in life that are disappointing, aren't they? A good vacation, delicious food, an experience with friends, marriage, family. They all have a certain kind of disappointment to them. And a whole lot of people go, yeah, I didn't really want to admit. Yeah, it is disappointing, isn't it? So what are we going to do with that disappointment? And well, here's some options, but it does seem to me that we have to acknowledge the disappointment. And sometimes I think we need to let people feel that for a while. By the way, am I talking too much? Well, you can edit these things out.
You are a guest on our show, and so this is all cool.
Oh, that's right. So Mere Christianity, the book, is the written form of a whole bunch of radio broadcasts. And at first, they just thought they were going to do maybe just 5 or 6. And they were 15 minutes long, and they were 1 week apart. And so Lewis would do the first one, 15 minutes, and then stop. And then people had a whole week to kind of mull it over and think about it. Now, when we read the book, we just turn the page and read the next chapter because the chapters are pretty short. And you could read the whole book in, I don't know, a day or a couple of days. But that whole finished book was really over 3 years worth of radio broadcasts, pause for several months. Hey, people liked it. Let's do another 5, and then pause for even more months. And so Lewis knew he was just building an argument over time and wanting people to chew on things for a while. And there's this one place in either the 4th or the 5th week. So again, people have heard a 15-minute broadcast, wait a week, 15-minute broadcast. And he says something like, do not think that I'm going faster than I really am. I'm not within 100 miles of the God of the Bible yet. So for a whole month, he's kind of building this very gradual case. I mean, he starts out with, how do we know right and wrong? I mean, and yet there is something inside of us, isn't it? I mean, somebody steals your seat on the bus, you go, hey, that was my seat, get up. And we're appealing to some kind of, I don't know, objective standard of right and wrong. And that was the first 15 minutes. And it comes to the end is, all I'm trying to say is there's some kind of standard and we all fall short of it. Good night. And now back to the BBC for, I don't know what came next.
Now listen with Mother.
That's right.
And yet I just love the fact that he's holding his nerve, because he's doing this during World War II, and people are dying all the time. And there are bombs being dropped on London and all over the UK, over Belfast, over Glasgow, over Birmingham, over Coventry. And, there's been Dunkirk, and there's about to be Pearl Harbor. And he's just sort of intriguing and then says, speak to you next time. And it feels like our culture is almost rediscovering that sense of intrigue, because previously we had binge watching, which I'm not sure is a particularly healthy thing. Binge eating is not good. So I don't know why binge watching is okay. So it just feels like the idea that something comes on and then you have a week to think about it and watch the next one. And of course, I know that, Netflix or Prime or whoever will do that so that you don't cancel your subscription. Because there's something sad about watching 3 episodes of something in a night. And, I've just been watching Stranger Things, and we've limited ourselves to, we watch one, and then tomorrow we'll watch the next one. And no matter how curious you are to keep going, you just think, no, it'll do me good. And we see that with Jesus intriguing people. His parables, just the more you read his parables, the weirder and more intriguing they get. And then they just sort of end. It's just, they're extraordinary. And I've just been looking at Luke 19, which ends with the king saying, bring them out here and kill them in front of me. whoa, what? And that's the one that in the middle of that, he says, take the talent from the one, for the mina from the one, and give it to the one who has 10. And everyone explodes with, he's already got 10. Doesn't address it. And so Jesus kind of keeps doing this. He keeps messing with people and walking away. And it feels like we don't hold our nerve. And Lewis does that, doesn't he? He holds his nerve. And and Narnia is the ultimate expression of that, where he doesn't explain it. These days he'd be real put under pressure to provide readers' notes. But he doesn't.
Right.
So what do we do though with that? Because it seems to me a lot of that is rooted in the biblical injunction that the time is short.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I think maybe a lot of people who have got their hearts in the right place, that as far as they're concerned, we're all standing on the deck of the Titanic. It's going down.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have time to be constructing metaphors and writing novels and making music and doing paintings. There's, people are dying here. It sounds like, an episode of Quincy or something. So how do we square those two things? I mean, maybe it is more of a trust in the sovereignty of God that we say we believe in. Maybe that's, yes. What do you think on that?
Oh, sure. It's that. It's also, there's two aspects of things. So one, going back to when you were saying about Lewis was doing these radio broadcasts during World War II, I think I don't remember anything specifically stated this way from him, but I think he thought, okay, there already is plenty of reaping or calling to decision, or if people are really at that stage of the process, they're probably going to go to church. And they're probably going to hear a gospel presentation and a call to respond. So he thought, okay, they're inviting me not to preach at a church. They're inviting me to do radio broadcasts on the BBC. So I'm trying to reach people who they're probably not going to church this Sunday or any Sunday anytime soon. So I think part of it was he saw where what he was doing and who he was trying to reach. That's the first thing. The other thing is, and I do know he said this, he saw himself as a person who was much more gifted, called by God for that pre part of it. He did say at one point, he said, the ideal thing would be to team me up with one other person who was like the preacher who called for the decision. And I would talk for a while and just kind of build interest and build ideas and imagery. And then you have somebody else come along who says, now repent and believe. So it's realizing the span of the audience, and then our place of how God has gifted us. So I do try to make a call for that somewhere in the book of figure out who you are. What gifts has God given you? What kind of things have your name on them? And you find yourself wanting to talk pre with people. And there's other people who love calling for a decision. Now, the problem is the people who I believe are genuinely called by God to be the reapers at the end of the process, they very often give guilt to all of us who are called to the sowing side of things. But Jesus talked about the need for both sowing and reaping. And isn't it beautiful there where he says, in the end, the sower and the reaper will be joyful together. So I just think we need to know, like, how has God gifted me, and where do I find myself having conversations?
And also the implication, as you point out in the book, which is that the sowing is actually that's the really hard part, and we quite often flip it around the other way. We see the person doing the reaping and we're like, wow, that's just amazing. But in some ways, it's the farmer who says, well, no, I don't like sowing. It's really hard work. It's backbreaking. It's boring. I'll just do the reaping. It's like, it doesn't work like that.
Yeah.
Like there's got to
reap the weeds. That's all you're going to be reaping.
I quote in the book a book that was so very helpful for me by Tim Downs, Finding Common Ground. And it's this whole book arguing for the need for sowing. And by the way, Barry, I appreciate that you said that I said it was hard, but I got that idea from Jesus. So he's the one, he's the one who said
Right.
they do the hard work of sowing. And it is hard work. I mean, you know, you have a conversation with someone about music or art or beauty and a sunset, and you talk about these things with people, and you try to get them to see, oh, there's something really, you know, significant going on here, and then say, well, do you ever wonder about, you know, why are we drawn to sunset so much? I think that's hard work, and the more we start seeing their resistance to spiritual things, and you want to keep pressing, but you want to press gently and lovingly. I think that's really difficult stuff.
The other thing that Lewis wrote is I remember reading An Experiment in Criticism, and I think I probably understood about a quarter of it. And I remember thinking I should probably read that book every year for 10 years, and then I might understand it. But it is accessible enough for some things to be clear. And there's a bit that really stuck out to me, which is where he talks about, in a way, how we evaluate art. And it's easy to mistake, for example, good art for art that's about something that you like, which are not the same thing. So you may have bad art about Jesus, and Jesus is great, but the art is lousy. Don't confuse the two. But in order to get to that position, Lewis says about surrendering. He says the first demand any work of art makes upon us is surrender. Look, listen, receive, get yourself out the way. There is no good asking first whether the work before you deserves such a surrender, for until you have surrendered, you cannot possibly find out. Now, some of our friends, you know, would say, oh, what? So it's okay to watch Game of Thrones, is it? Which was the topic of our very first episode of this podcast a few years ago. But how do we feel about that? Because in a way, I would like to agree with C.S. Lewis there, but I can hear hackles rising. I can hear, you know, warning bells sounding for some. What are we to make of that?
On the pragmatic end of this, we can learn from C.S. Lewis that art has a way of getting through to people that sometimes logical arguments and reasons don't. And so he had that great statement of sneaking past watchful dragons, telling a story, reciting a poem, hearing a song. It goes around from the front armor and goes around the side and sneaks in. So that's on a very pragmatic side. And that's an important aspect of it, but that's not all there is to it. There is this other aspect of God has made his world with all sorts of things that are beautiful, that don't serve any pragmatic purpose other than just being beautiful and bringing glory to a God who decides he wants to create thousands of varieties of frogs. Why? And in the Genesis 1 account of creation, you keep hearing that phrase of this after its kind, after its kind, after its kind. It's God saying there's so much diversity. I created it that way. I wanted there to be thousands of different kinds of leaves of different colors. And so, I mean, again, I keep going back. Why are sunsets so beautiful? They don't need to be. The Earth turns with, you know, the same speed and efficiency, whether it's beautiful or not. But, you know, people wake up really early in the morning to go see a sunrise, and they linger longer to watch a sunset. And I remember one time being at a beach, and just this whole crowd gathered and watched the sunset. And when the sun finally just, you know, got down to the very, very bottom, and then it's like a little spreading of light, and then it disappeared, people applauded. I love it. So if God created the world with so much beauty and then reveals to us things like the heavens declare the glory of God, then beauty and art and creativity are part of the very essence of what it means to be created in the image of a creative God. So that's why we want to employ those things, not just because, this will really get through to people. Well, yes, it will, but it's also bringing glory to a God who, in addition to sending his son to die on the cross to atone for sins, he also created visual beauty and delicious food and all sorts of things like that.
Excellent. Yeah, no, it's that's a really helpful way of thinking about it. Unnecessary beauty. I think that's kind of almost the definition of beauty. I
just thought of something. Can I just jump in again?
Jump
Too
in
late.
again.
I already did. Okay, I love this. I don't know where I wrote about this, or maybe I didn't, and I just think I wrote, which is kind of sad. But
is this going to be Jesus again? You're going to be taking credit for something, Jesus?
No, this time it's Paul. So in Acts 14, okay, so you have this logical, theological sermon that Paul preaches in Acts 13 in a synagogue on a Sabbath day. And then he have this very logical, intellectual, reasoned lecture. He preaches, he presents, he orates on Mars Hill in Acts 17. Okay, in between Acts 14, there's this crazy story of Paul and Barnabas heal this man, and the people who are not religious Jews, like the ones in the synagogue, and they're not secular philosophers like Mars Hill, they're pagan worshipers of pagan gods. And they start bowing down and making sacrifices to Paul and Barnabas because they think they're Zeus and Hermes. And Paul says, stop this. We're just you need to repent. And then he says, God has not left himself without a witness, and he has sent rain in its seasons and crops and food and joy in your hearts. Now, if ever there was a pre-evangelistic presentation that I want to latch onto, it was that food as pre-evangelism and joy in your hearts. Why do you think food makes you so happy? Why is it that when you get together with other people and you start cracking jokes and you're laughing, it's such joy? Where did that come from? It's a God who made us to have the kind of minds that laugh at jokes and taste delicious food and say, isn't this wonderful? And Lewis has this line, I think it's in Letters to Malcolm. It says, one's mind runs back up the sunbeam to the sun. So that's the kind of pre-evangelistic conversations we need to have. Isn't this meal delicious? Like, why do you suppose food has so much variety to it? And especially when it has a lot of saturated fat. Oh, sorry. Didn't mean to put a bad spin on that.
Why were we given tongues with this amount of taste buds on so that we can appreciate it?
Uh-huh.
Let's just wrap up this part. Hopefully you can hang on for a few more minutes after we've wrapped up on Patreon. We might have one or two more questions. I might do you some quick fire questions because I'm obviously going to ask about that hideous strength at some point, which I'm slightly obsessed with. But my question is, to wrap this up really is, so C.S. Lewis, I think it's just this gigantic hero that loomed large over the church. And there are people who make a living just talking about C.S. Lewis and that kind of stuff. I guess we're aware of the fact that people have feet of clay and that C.S. Lewis kind of, had one or two funny ideas. He had some strange relationships, like with that lady in Oxford who was his housekeeper. Okay. There's some people get quite angry about what he does to Susan in Narnia, and the fact that she doesn't come back and that kind of stuff. How can we be, I don't think any of these are, cancel Lewis by any means, but how do we see Lewis rightly within this? Because he's not the Messiah and would not claim to be, but it's very easy for us to kind of basically hang on his every word. How do we negotiate that one, do you think?
I don't know if I have any brilliant insight on this other than, he was wrong a bunch of times. So his books are not the inspired, inerrant word of God. And so there's times when you're reading and you go, oh, no, really? An editor didn't stop that? So there are just some places where he's not just wrong, he's very wrong. And so for what I can do is, well, okay, the parts where he's right are so helpful, both because of what he says and how he says it and how he words it. So, yes, I think he has made mistakes, and it would be.
Can you just give us what would be one thing just to look out for if you read a lot of Lewis? What idea might you come across where you want to go?
Toward the end of Mere Christianity, he raises the question about, is Jesus the only way? And he says, well, yes, he is, except that some people can find that way through other religions. And he kind of implies that if you're just a really good Buddhist, then you're going to find Jesus without realizing it, but he's there. No, he isn't. That's wrong. That's just plain wrong. And I think part of it was he did have this heart as an evangelist, and he wanted so desperately for people to get it that he tried to minimize some of the harder, sharper edges. And in the process, I think he compromised. So that's just the place that I find that I go, well, no, he was wrong there. And if I ever give somebody a copy of Mere Christianity, I said, I'd really love to talk to you about this, because I think there's so much that's good about it. But, he was a flawed human being who made some mistakes too. So, there's some places in his book, Reflections on the Psalms. I love that book. And then there are whole sections that I just think, no, you really, it's too bad we didn't get a tutor for you on this one, Jack. Because his views about scripture in certain places were kind of classic liberal theology of, well, this really wasn't inspired, or I don't know. I think I just kind of shrug those parts off. But then there are other parts in that same book that I just think, oh my goodness, that is so brilliant. And I'll never be able to think about that issue the same way because of the light that he shined on it. So, so
it's true, isn't it? I mean, the Holy Spirit means that even people like us say occasionally some things which are insightful and useful to people. So how much more, for somebody like Clive, but.
I love the fact that he thought all of his books would be out of print and he'd be totally forgotten 5 years after he died. Boy, was he wrong on that one.
Wow.
Yeah. It reminds me of our chat there with John Dixon when he was talking about how when we look back and say, wow, how come the Crusaders didn't see that? It's just like, just bear in mind that in 300 years' time, when they look back at us, they will have some grave reservations to things that we are currently blind to. I guess you get a sense of that sort of universalism. It's not quite that at the end of the last battle, but it's interesting that the follower of Tash, that the noble guy who is there at the last battle, but Susan isn't. So clearly he's not a complete universalist. But that's probably a chat for another time. We should wrap this up, shouldn't we, Barry?
Yeah, Randy, thank you so much for joining us once again. It's just such a joy always to have these conversations. Hope we can do it again soon.
I do. I hope so too. Thanks.
And that for the last time on this part anyway,
Here we go.
The book is called Mere Evangelism by Randy Newman, and it is published from the good people at the Good Book Company, but it's probably widely available in all good bookshops and several lousy ones as well.
Almost certainly.
Yeah, seems quite
If you want to get in touch with us, as always, cooperandcarey@gmail.com. We are on Instagram for the time being, and we're on Twitter as well, and Facebook. If you would like even more Cooper and Cary, you can do so. If you wanted access to yet more Randy Newman, of course you do, then you could become a patron of Cooper and Cary, which for less than the price of a grande Starbucks means that you get to listen to two English chimps try to justify their existence on a bi-weekly basis.
As if infinite number of monkeys, as if on typewriters.
Yeah.
And also Barry, we do have merch, and Barry is wearing merch. We can see there that we even have a T-shirt, which makes
I'm not sure if it's terribly narcissistic to go out wearing your own name on your own clothing. It is, isn't it, really?
You see, I haven't bought one yet because I still live in England and I still have reserve, but it's too late for Barry. He's moved to Florida.
It's okay. If people don't know who I am, that's fair enough, which, let's face it, is most of the world, so that's all good.
Thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll speak to you next time. Cheerio.
Cheers. Bye.